The soft glow of stained glass windows painted the church in hues of sapphire and gold. For Claire, the air itself felt different today, thick with a sense of peace and quiet joy. It was Daniel's baptism, a day she had dreamed of since she first held him in her arms. At 5 years old, her son was a whirlwind of energy and laughter, a bright little sun in her universe. He stood beside her now, looking uncharacteristically solemn in his crisp white suit, his small hand clutching hers. He seemed to understand in his own childlike way that this was a special day, a milestone, a promise. The pews were filled with the warm faces of friends and family who had watched Daniel grow. Her own parents were in the front row, dabbing their eyes with a shared handkerchief. Her husband, Mark, stood tall and proud on her other side, his arm a comforting weight around her shoulders. It was a perfect picture, a mosaic of love she had painstakingly pieced together over the years. Yet, even in the fullness of the moment, a small, hollow space remained, a single empty seat in the landscape of her heart. 5 years. It felt like a lifetime. 5 years since she had last seen her mother-in-law, Margaret. The argument had been monumental, a clash of wills and worlds that had left their relationship in shattered fragments. It started with petty disagreements over how to raise Daniel, comments about Claire's decision to work, criticisms of their parenting choices, unsolicited advice that felt more like judgment. The final fracture came during what was supposed to be a calm family dinner. Words were exchanged that could not be taken back, accusations that cut deeper than either of them had intended. Margaret had walked out that night, and the silence she left behind had been deafening, stretching from days into weeks, then months, and finally, impossibly, into years. Claire had tried to bridge the gap. She sent photos of Daniel, short, hopeful text messages on birthdays and holidays. Each was met with a stark, unyielding silence. Mark, caught in the middle, was torn between his wife and his mother. He spoke to Margaret on the phone in hushed, strained conversations that always ended with him looking defeated. "She's just stubborn," he would say, a familiar sadness in his eyes. "She'll come around." But she never did. And so, Daniel grew up knowing only one set of grandparents, his life marked by the conspicuous absence of the other. He would see photos of Margaret from before the rift, a smiling woman with Mark's eyes, and ask, "Who is that, Mommy?" Claire's answer was always the same, a carefully constructed half-truth. "That's your daddy's mommy. She lives far away." So, as she stood in the church, surrounded by love, she did not expect to see the figure standing in the shadows at the back, near the heavy oak doors. A woman, elegantly dressed in a pearl gray coat, her hair the same silver as Claire remembered, though perhaps a little thinner now. Her posture was rigid, uncertain, as if she were testing the ground beneath her feet. For a heart-stopping moment, Claire's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. After all this time, after all the silence, it just couldn't be. But as the woman took a hesitant step forward into a sliver of light, her face became clear. It was Margaret. A flood of conflicting emotions washed over Claire, so powerful it threatened to knock her off balance. Shock was the first wave, cold and sharp. Then came a flicker of anger, hot and familiar, licking at the edges of her composure. How dare she? How dare she show up now, on this day of all days, after 5 years of treating them like strangers? Did she expect to just slip back into their lives as if no time had passed, as if no wounds had been inflicted? Claire's grip on Daniel's hand tightened, a protective instinct surging through her. She felt Mark stiffen beside her, his sharp intake of breath a clear sign that he had seen his mother too. He glanced at Claire, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a plea for calm. The priest's voice, a gentle and melodic baritone, called them forward. The ceremony was beginning. Claire forced her legs to move, her steps feeling heavy and disconnected. She walked toward the font, every nerve in her body aware of the figure at the back of the church. She could feel Margaret's gaze like a physical weight, a silent observer to a life she had chosen to abandon. Claire tried to focus on the present, on the sacredness of the moment. She looked at Daniel, whose innocent face was tilted up towards the priest, his brow furrowed in concentration. This was for him. She wouldn't let Margaret's sudden appearance cast a shadow over it. As the priest anointed Daniel's head with holy water, tracing the sign of the cross, Claire's heart ached with a fierce, protective love. The water glistened on her son's forehead, a symbol of purity and new beginnings. In that instant, nothing else mattered but the child before her and the promises being made on his behalf. She mouthed the responses automatically, her voice a little shaky, but her focus remained locked on her son. She was his shield, his advocate. She had been for 5 years, and she would continue to be. The ceremony concluded with a warm round of applause from their guests. Daniel, now officially baptized, beamed, the solemnity of the moment replaced by his usual sunny disposition. As friends and family began to move, chatting and making their way towards the church hall for the reception, the path to the back of the church cleared. There was no avoiding it now. Margaret was no longer a figure in the shadows, but a solid, undeniable presence. She hadn't moved, but she was no longer looking at them. Her gaze was fixed on Daniel, and the expression on her face was one Claire had never seen before. It wasn't the hard, judgmental look from her memories. It was something else entirely, a fragile, aching mixture of regret and longing. Mark took a deep breath and squeezed Claire's shoulder. "Wait here," he whispered, his voice strained. He started walking down the aisle, his steps measured, each one closing the 5-year gap between mother and son. Claire watched him go, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knelt down to be at eye level with Daniel. "You did so wonderfully, my love," she said, smoothing his damp hair. Daniel, however, was no longer looking at her. His attention had been captured by the scene unfolding at the end of the aisle. He watched his father approach the woman in the gray coat. He had never seen her before, yet there was a strange familiarity in the line of her shoulders, a faint echo of his own father. He tugged on Claire's sleeve, his voice a curious whisper. "Mommy," he asked, his eyes full of innocent confusion. "Who is that lady?" Claire's heart felt like it was caught in a vice. How could she possibly answer a question that held 5 years of pain, silence, and unanswered calls? Before she could find the words, she watched Mark reach his mother. There was no embrace, no dramatic reunion, just a few feet of awkward space between them, filled with the heavy weight of unspoken history. From this distance, Claire couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could read the language of their bodies. Mark's shoulders were slumped, a familiar sign of his exhaustion with this long, painful family schism. Margaret's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. She kept glancing past her son, her eyes drawn irresistibly to the small boy in the white suit. The conversation was brief. Mark gestured back towards Claire and Daniel. Margaret nodded, a small, jerky movement. And then, together, they began to walk up the aisle. Each step they took was a drumbeat, counting down to a moment Claire was utterly unprepared for. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? What was she supposed to say? Part of her wanted to scoop Daniel up and run, to shield him from the complicated, messy emotions of the adults. But another, smaller part of her recognized the profound sorrow in Margaret's eyes. It wasn't the look of a monster, but of a woman who seemed to be drowning in her own mistakes. Daniel remained fixated on the approaching pair. Children have an uncanny ability to sense emotional currents, and the air was now charged with a fragile, heavy tension. He didn't seem scared, merely curious. "Is she a friend of Daddy's?" he asked again, his voice clear and innocent in the echoing space of the church. Claire started, her own voice barely a whisper. "She is someone Daddy has known for a very long time." It was the best she could manage, a fragile truth that didn't feel like a lie. And then they were there. Mark stood beside her, his hand finding hers in a silent gesture of support. And Margaret stood before them, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Claire had ever seen her. The years had softened her features, etching fine lines of what looked like worry around her eyes and mouth. The severe, authoritative woman from Claire's memories was gone, replaced by someone who looked hesitant, almost frightened. Margaret's gaze fell upon Daniel, and for a moment she seemed incapable of speech. Her eyes welled up, and she fought to hold the tears back, her composure hanging by a thread. She knelt down slowly, her movements stiff, until she was on his level. It was a gesture of supplication, of surrender. It was the last thing Claire had ever expected. Margaret looked at Daniel, her expression a canvas of raw, unfiltered emotion. Regret, hope, and a deep, gut-wrenching love all swirled in her tear-filled eyes. Daniel, unafraid, simply looked back at her. He studied her face with the frank, open curiosity of a child. He saw the silver hair, the eyes that looked like his daddy's, and the tears that trembled on her lashes. He processed the scene before him, the strange woman, his father's tense silence, his mother's watchful stillness. He tilted his head, a small frown of concentration on his face. Then, in the quiet church, his voice rang out, clear and piercingly honest, asking the question that would shatter the silence of 5 long years. "Do I call you Grandma?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. Or do I call you stranger? The question hung in the air, a perfect crystalline thing. It was devoid of malice, free from the weight of history that the adults carried. It was pure, unadulterated truth, spoken from the heart of a child trying to make sense of his world, and it shattered Margaret completely. A choked sob escaped her lips, the sound ragged and torn. The tears she had been fighting so fiercely now streamed down her cheeks, unchecked. The word stranger was the final blow, the one that broke through 5 years of stubborn pride, because it was true. To this beautiful, innocent boy who shared her blood, she was nothing more than a stranger in a gray coat. She had traded the precious title of Grandma for years of bitter silence, and the magnitude of her loss was crashing down on her all at once, right here on the cold stone floor of the church. Claire felt an unexpected pang of compassion. The anger she had held onto for so long seemed to dissolve, replaced by a profound sadness for the woman kneeling before her son. She saw not the formidable matriarch who had judged her, but a broken grandmother grieving the moments she could never get back. All the birthdays, the first steps, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, all of it, gone. Mark moved closer, placing a hand on his mother's trembling shoulder, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. He was witnessing a pain he had long feared, but had been powerless to prevent. Daniel, for his part, just watched her cry. He didn't recoil. He didn't look away. He just waited, his expression patient, as if he understood that his question had unlocked something deep and important. It took Margaret a full minute to find her voice. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so vulnerable and unlike the poised woman Claire remembered. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her gaze still locked on Daniel's. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears, but it was clear. "You can call me Grandma," she whispered, the word itself sounding like a prayer on her lips. She offered him a watery, tremulous smile. "I would like that more than anything in the world. But I know I haven't earned it yet. I know I have been a stranger. And that is my fault, Daniel. Not yours, not your mommy's, not your daddy's. Mine." She reached out a hesitant hand, not to touch him, but as if to simply bridge the space between them. "I hope," she continued, her voice cracking with emotion, "that one day you will want to call me Grandma. I hope you will give me the chance to be one to you." The honesty was staggering. Claire had expected excuses, justifications, perhaps even a subtle shifting of blame. She had not expected this raw, unconditional surrender. This was not a demand for forgiveness, but a humble plea for a chance. Mark helped his mother to her feet. She looked from Claire to Mark, her eyes begging for a response. I received the invitation," she said softly, her voice still shaky. "I almost didn't come. I was so afraid, but I couldn't miss this. I couldn't miss one more day." The church was nearly empty now, their guests having moved on to the reception. The three of them stood in a silent triangle, the emotional debris of 5 years scattered around them. It was Mark who broke the silence. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let's go to the hall. We can talk there. All of us." The reception hall was a stark contrast to the solemn quiet of the church. It buzzed with cheerful chatter and laughter. A long table was laden with food, and children, freed from the constraints of the ceremony, ran in joyful circles on the polished floor. For a moment, entering the lively room felt like surfacing for air. But for Claire, Mark, and Margaret, the small bubble of tension remained, an invisible shield separating them from the celebration. They found a small, unoccupied table in a corner, away from the main hub of activity. It felt like a tiny island in a sea of noise. For a few awkward moments, nobody spoke. Margaret twisted the strap of her handbag, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth. Claire watched Daniel join his cousins, a flash of white in a swarm of colorful party clothes. He was laughing, completely absorbed in his play, the weight of the moment in the church already forgotten, as only a child's can be. Finally, it was Margaret who broke the silence, her voice still fragile. "Claire," she began, looking up at her daughter-in-law for the first time with a direct, pleading gaze. "I know I'm sorry isn't enough. It can't possibly be enough to cover 5 years. I was wrong. I was proud and stubborn, and I let my anger build a wall that I became too afraid and too ashamed to climb over." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Every photo you sent, every message, I saw them. Each one was a little crack in the wall, but I was too foolish to help break it down. I hurt you. I hurt Mark. And worst of all, I missed out on knowing him." Her eyes drifted towards Daniel, and a fresh wave of pain crossed her face. "He is so beautiful, so bright. And he had to ask if I was a stranger. I will carry the shame of that question for the rest of my life. Claire listened, letting the words settle. The apology was real, deeper than she had anticipated. The anger that had been her constant companion for years was gone, leaving behind only a vast, empty space filled with sorrow. I appreciate you saying that, Margaret, Claire said, her voice even, and I believe you mean it. But you're right. It's not enough to erase everything. For 5 years, I've had to answer my son's questions about why his daddy's mommy never calls. I've watched my husband ache over the silence from his own mother. That kind of pain doesn't just disappear overnight. She wasn't saying it to be cruel, but to be honest. A wound that deep needed more than a single apology to heal. It needed air and light and time. I know, Margaret said, nodding, her eyes welling up again. I don't expect your forgiveness, Claire. I only ask for a chance. The chance to show you, to show Daniel, that I can be better, that I want to be his grandmother if you'll let me. Mark, who had been sitting in silence between them, finally spoke. This is a start, he said, looking from his mother to his wife. His voice was thick with emotion. It's all I've wanted for years. A start. He reached across the table, placing one hand on Claire's and the other on Margaret's. It wasn't a gesture of resolution, but one of hope, a bridge built between two shores. As if on cue, Daniel came running over to their table, his face flushed with excitement. He held up a small toy car. He ignored the heavy emotional atmosphere, his focus entirely on the new person at the table. He looked directly at Margaret, holding the car out for her to see. Look, he said, his voice bright and clear. It's a blue one. For a second that stretched into an eternity, Margaret simply stared at the small blue car offered in Daniel's outstretched hand. It was such a simple, ordinary gesture, yet it felt monumental. It was an invitation, a bridge built not of pained words and fragile apologies, but of plastic and paint, and a child's desire to share a moment of joy. This was the world she had been missing, not the grand milestones, but the tiny, perfect moments in between. A fresh tear slipped down Margaret's cheek, but this one was different. It wasn't born of regret or shame, but of a profound, heart-swelling gratitude. She quickly wiped it away, not wanting to frighten him. She managed another watery smile, this one more genuine than the last. It's a beautiful car, Daniel, she said, her voice soft and a little hoarse. Blue is my favorite color. Daniel beamed, his mission accomplished. It's a fast one, he declared, then proceeded to run it across the tablecloth, making quiet, vroom noises. He didn't ask for her story. He didn't care about the years of silence. He just accepted her presence, here and now, as the new person who liked his blue car. Claire watched the exchange, and the last of her defenses crumbled. All her carefully constructed walls of anger and resentment, built to protect her heart from further pain, suddenly felt pointless. They hadn't just been keeping Margaret out. They had been keeping Daniel in. She had been so focused on the grandmother he didn't have that she hadn't considered the one he could have. Seeing them together, even in this fleeting, simple interaction, was like seeing a missing piece of a puzzle click into place. Daniel deserved this. He deserved to have a grandmother who would admire his toy cars and tell him blue was her favorite color. He deserved all the love he could get, from every possible corner of his life. The decision settled in her heart, quiet and clear. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the pain didn't happen. It was about choosing a different future. For Daniel. And maybe, just maybe, for herself, too. The burden of anger was heavier than she had realized. Mark watched them all, a look of profound relief on his face. He saw his son, happy and carefree. He saw his mother, her pride finally dismantled by a child's honesty. And he saw his wife, her expression softening, the guarded look in her eyes finally beginning to recede. The knot of tension that had lived in his stomach for 5 years began to slowly, finally, unwind. As the party began to thin out and guests started saying their goodbyes, Margaret seemed to realize that the moment was ending. A flicker of panic crossed her face, the fear that this fragile connection might evaporate as soon as they walked out the door. She looked at Claire and Mark, her eyes full of unspoken anxiety. I don't want this to be the last time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to be a stranger again. It was Claire who answered, and her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. It doesn't have to be, she said. She looked at Margaret, meeting her gaze directly. But it has to be different this time. No more assumptions, no more judgment, just respect and honesty. Anything, Margaret breathed, nodding vigorously. Anything. You can set the rules. I just want to be here. Claire took a breath. How about we start with a phone call? This week, we can see how it goes. It was a small step, a tiny fragile seedling of a new beginning, but for Margaret it was everything. Yes, she said, relief flooding her features. Yes, I'd like that very much. When it was time to leave, Margaret walked with them to the church parking lot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air had grown cool. There was a final, awkward pause by Margaret's car, the space between them once again feeling fragile. Daniel, sleepy after the long day, was leaning against Claire's legs. Margaret knelt one last time, not as a stranger pleading for entry, but simply as a woman saying goodbye to her grandson. "It was so wonderful to meet you properly today, Daniel," she said softly. Daniel, his thumb creeping towards his mouth, just gave her a small, sleepy wave. It was enough. Margaret looked up at Claire, her eyes conveying a universe of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, the words encompassing everything. For the chance, for the hope, for the phone call that hadn't even happened yet, but already felt like a lifeline. Claire gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement that was both a beginning and an end. As they drove away, Claire glanced in the rearview mirror. Margaret stood by her car, not moving, just watching them go until they turned the corner and were out of sight. In the car, Daniel was asleep in his car seat within minutes, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The silence that filled the car was different from the one they had lived with for 5 years. This one was comfortable, contemplative. "I never thought I'd see that happen," Mark said, breaking the quiet. His voice was raw with emotion. "I never thought I'd see her and you in the same room without a fight." And Daniel, what he said. "He just said the truth," Claire replied, her gaze soft as she looked at her sleeping son. "Kids are like that. They see things for what they are." There was no history for him, no anger, just a person he didn't know. She turned to her husband, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "I was so angry for so long, Mark. I think I'm tired of being angry. It didn't fix anything. It just kept us all in a prison." Mark reached over and squeezed her hand, his own eyes wet. "Thank you, Claire," he said, "for being open to this. For him." He glanced back at Daniel. "And for me." The following Wednesday, the phone rang. Claire saw the unfamiliar number and her stomach tightened for a second before she remembered. She took a breath and answered. "Hello? Claire? It's Margaret." Her voice was hesitant, nervous. "Hi, Margaret," Claire said, keeping her own tone calm and even. I was just calling, like we said." There was an awkward pause. "How is Daniel? Did he have a good week at preschool?" The question was simple, normal, the kind of question a grandmother asks. "He did," Claire said, and she found herself smiling faintly. "He came home with a finger painting of what he says is a dinosaur, but it looks more like a purple blob." Margaret laughed, a real, genuine laugh that Claire hadn't heard in years. "I'd love to see it sometime," she said, the hope in her voice unmistakable. "Maybe you can," Claire replied. One small step. A month later, on a Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang. Daniel, who had been told his grandma Margaret was coming to visit, ran to the door. Claire opened it to find Margaret on the doorstep, holding not a gift for Daniel, but a small potted orchid for Claire. "I remember you liked these," she said quietly. Later that afternoon, Claire stood in her kitchen, stirring sauce for dinner, the scent of the orchid perfuming the air. In the living room, she could hear the sound of laughter. She peeked around the corner. Margaret was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a legion of toy cars. Daniel was explaining the intricate social hierarchy of the cars, and Margaret was listening with rapt attention, asking questions at all the right moments. There was no tension, no awkwardness. Just a little boy and his grandmother playing on a Saturday. Claire leaned against the doorframe, a genuine, unburdened smile spreading across her face. She thought back to the baptism, to the question that had changed everything. "Do I call you grandma or stranger?" It was a choice, she realized, not just for Daniel, but for all of them. A stranger is just a story you haven't heard yet. A grandma is a story you choose to write together. In the end, they had chosen to turn the page and start a new chapter. It wouldn't erase the 5 years of silence, but it promised a future filled with noise, laughter, and the happy vrooming of little blue cars.